You save for a decade. You bleed into the soil to carve out a corner of the world that's yours. Then you take 3 weeks off to celebrate marrying the woman you love, and you come back to find a concrete wall slicing right through your backyard. An HOA you don't even belong to decided your land was their land. They destroyed a legacy garden to do it. They told me to take it to court. I decided to take it to the property line instead. My name is David. My wife Sarah and I aren't wealthy people. We are the kind of people who check the price of chicken breasts at the grocery store and fix our own running toilets to save a plumber's fee. 5 years ago, we bought a house. It was a 1960s single-story brick ranch sitting on just under an acre of land at the end of a long, winding county road. It was imperfect. The roof dipped slightly in the middle, and the original windows leaked cold air in November, but it was ours. Most importantly, it had the garden. My grandfather had originally owned the lot. He spent 30 years cultivating a border of lilacs, hydrangeas, and 2 massive, sprawling Japanese maples that flanked the western side of the property. When I bought the house from his estate, keeping that garden alive felt like a blood oath. But progress is a bulldozer, and it doesn't care about your grandfather. 2 years after we moved in, a developer bought the 80 acres of rolling pasture surrounding our property. Within 18 months, the pasture was gone. In its place rose Oak Ridge Estates. It was a textbook, copy-and-paste suburban utopia. 3-story monstrosities with unnecessary gables, 3-car garages, and lawns so chemically treated they looked like plastic. Our acre of land suddenly became an island in a sea of beige stucco. We were completely surrounded on 3 sides by the Oak Ridge subdivision. Our driveway connected to the main county road, but the western edge of our property, where the lilacs and maples stood, ran flush against the side yards of 4 new Oak Ridge homes. And with Oak Ridge came the Homeowners Association. I met Richard 3 months before my wedding. Richard was the HOA president. He was a man who looked like he had been genetically engineered in a country club laboratory. He wore pastel polo shirts, khaki shorts with braided leather belts, and always seemed to be carrying a clipboard, even on Sundays. He caught me pulling weeds near the property line one afternoon. "David, right," Richard had said, leaning over the temporary wire fence the builders had left. He didn't offer his hand. "We've been getting some complaints from the new residents. Your yard is a bit untamed. The leaves from those maples are blowing into the Oak Ridge pools, and your fence is rotting." I stood up, wiping dirt on my jeans. "It's a farm fence, Richard. It's been there since 1982, and trees have leaves." "Right. Well," Richard tapped his pen against his clipboard, "we're trying to establish a certain aesthetic standard here. Excellence in living. I've checked the bylaws. If you'd like to integrate into the HOA, we could arrange a subsidized landscaping package, bring you up to code." "I don't belong to the HOA," I said, keeping my voice level. "My property predates your development. I don't pay your dues and I don't follow your bylaws." Richard smiled. It was a thin, bloodless thing. "We're a community, David. It's best when everyone pulls in the same direction. Property values affect us all." I walked away. I had a wedding to plan. Sarah and I were exhausted. We were working full-time, paying for the wedding ourselves, and managing the endless logistics of family, catering, and seating charts. By the time the wedding day arrived, we were running on fumes and caffeine. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception was a blur of faces and cheap champagne, and the next morning, we boarded a flight for a 3-week honeymoon in the Azores. We needed it. We needed total disconnection. No laptops, no cell service, no emails. Just ocean air, cheap wine, and sleep. We left the house locked tight. The mail paused and gave a spare key to my brother Mark, who lived an hour away, just in case of an emergency. For 3 weeks, the world did not exist. I didn't think about my job in logistics. I didn't think about the leaky windows, and I certainly didn't think about Richard and his beige empire next door. I should have. While I was swimming in the Atlantic, Richard was convening an emergency executive session of the Oak Ridge Estates, HOA. While Sarah and I were eating grilled seafood on a cliffside, Richard was hiring a surveying contractor with a very loose interpretation of property lines. And while we were sleeping in, a heavy-duty bobcat skid steer was ripping my grandfather's Japanese maples out of the earth by their roots. Travel fatigue is a unique kind of weight. It settles in your bones. By the time our Uber pulled onto our dark street at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, Sarah was asleep against my shoulder, and my eyes were burning. The headlights swept across the familiar curve of our driveway. The tires crunched on the gravel. I paid the driver, grabbed our heavy suitcases from the trunk, and turned toward the house. Something was wrong. The air felt different. It was a subtle shift in the acoustics of the yard. Usually, the wind rustled through the dense wall of lilacs on the western border, creating a soft, rushing sound. Tonight, the air was dead. I dropped the suitcases on the porch and hit the switch for the exterior floodlights. The halogen bulbs flared to life, casting harsh white light across the yard. Sarah let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She dropped her purse. It hit the wooden deck with a dull thud. I couldn't breathe. My lungs simply stopped working. The lilacs were gone. The Japanese maples were gone. The old wooden farm fence was gone. In their place stood a massive, continuous wall. It was 8 feet tall, built of gray cinder blocks slathered in wet-looking beige stucco and capped with imitation terracotta tiles. It ran the entire length of our western property line. Except it didn't run on the property line. Even in the harsh, flat lighting, my brain instantly calculated the geometry. The old fence had been the border. This new wall sat entirely on my side of where the fence used to be. It cut a straight line right through what used to be my garden, biting a 15-foot wide wedge out of my land. I walked off the porch, my legs feeling like they were moving through deep water. The grass beneath my shoes was crushed into muddy ruts by the treads of heavy machinery. Piles of displaced topsoil were shoved haphazardly against the side of my house. I reached the wall. I placed my palm flat against the stucco. It was cold. It was real. I looked down. Snapping out from beneath the bottom row of blocks was a single, crushed branch of a Japanese maple. The leaves were bruised and browning. 30 years of growth, pulverized and buried under thousands of pounds of masonry. "David!" Sarah's voice was trembling. She was standing on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "What did they do? David, what is this?" A hot, buzzing static filled my ears. It wasn't just anger. Anger is loud. Anger is throwing a punch. This was a deep, violently cold violation. Someone had come to the one place in the world that belonged to me, carved a piece of it out, and locked me away from it. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped it in the mud. I picked it up, wiped the screen on my jeans, and dialed the police. An hour later, a patrol car idled in my driveway, its red and blue lights pulsing lazily against the new wall. Officer Miller, a heavy-set guy who looked exactly as tired as I felt, stood in the mud with a flashlight. He shined the beam up and down the stucco, then clicked it off. He sighed, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. "So they built a wall," Miller said slowly. "They trespassed," I corrected, my voice raspy. "They brought heavy machinery onto my land, destroyed thousands of dollars of mature landscaping, and built an unpermitted structure 15 feet across my property line." Miller shifted his weight. "Mr. Hayes, I get that you're upset, but you were gone for 3 weeks. The wall is already up. I don't see anyone actively trespassing right now. I don't see any construction crews to sight. The wall is the trespass." I pointed at the monstrosity. "It's on my land." "Look," Miller said, his tone adopting that practiced, de-escalating flatness cops use when they don't want to do paperwork. "I can take a report for the damaged bushes, but as for where the property line actually is, that's a surveyor's job. If they claim it's their land and you claim it's yours, that's a property dispute. I can't arrest a wall, and I can't arrest the HOA board without a court order. So you're telling me," I stepped closer, lowering my voice, "that my neighbors can just annex a chunk of my property while I'm out of the country, and the police won't do a damn thing?" "I'm telling you it's a civil matter," Miller said firmly, stepping back toward his cruiser. "Get a lawyer. Sue the HOA. That's how this works. I'm sorry about your trees. Have a good night." I watched his taillights disappear down the road. The silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. Sarah came down from the porch and wrapped her arms around my waist, pressing her face into my back. I could feel her silently crying. I didn't cry. I just stared at the beige stucco until the sun started to rise, turning the gray sky into a bruised purple. The wall cast a long, dark shadow over the rest of my yard. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a poor, isolated holdout who couldn't afford to fight back. They thought I would look at this wall, weep over my crushed trees, and accept the new boundary because fighting it in court would take years and bankrupt me. They were right about the court part. I didn't have the money for a 5-year legal war of attrition against an HOA backed by a corporate developer's insurance policy. But I didn't need a lawyer. I just needed a lever, and I was going to find one. I didn't sleep. At 8:30 a.m. I showered, drank black coffee until my heart hammered against my ribs, and walked out my front door. I didn't walk to my car. I walked down the county road, turned right at the massive brick and wrought iron entrance of Oak Ridge Estates, and marched straight into the belly of the beast. Richard's house was the fourth one on the left. It was a pristine, sprawling corner lot. The grass was a terrifyingly uniform shade of emerald. Richard was in the driveway, using a microfiber cloth to wipe morning dew off his Audi. When he saw me marching up the sidewalk, he paused. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his polo collar. "David," Richard said smoothly, tossing the cloth onto the hood of his car. "Welcome back. How was the honeymoon?" I stopped at the edge of his driveway. I didn't step onto his concrete. "You built a wall on my land, Richard." He sighed, adopting the expression of a disappointed school principal. "David, let's not be dramatic. The community voted. Your property was a severe blight on the neighborhood aesthetic. We found an old statute regarding community improvement easements. The original plat maps were ambiguous, and our surveyor determined the historical boundary actually favored the subdivision. We did you a favor, really. We enclosed your yard. It's much cleaner now. You killed my grandfather's trees. You stole 15 feet of my land. We claimed a disputed easement to protect property values," Richard countered, his voice hardening. The polite facade dropped. "Look, I'll be frank. We have $150,000 in our legal reserve. If you want to fight this, you are more than welcome to hire a lawyer. We will bury you in injunctions, discovery requests, and appeals until you are forced to sell that dump just to pay your legal fees. Or you can go to Home Depot, buy some nice azaleas, plant them on your side of the wall, and move on with your life." He picked up his microfiber cloth and turned back to his car. "Have a good day, David." I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. I just turned around and walked home. Richard had given me a piece of information he didn't realize was valuable. He mentioned the original plat maps. He mentioned their surveyor. He was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have built the wall if he didn't have some piece of paper to wave in a judge's face to delay a lawsuit. Hey, but I knew my grandfather. He was a meticulous, paranoid man who kept every receipt he ever touched. I spent the next 3 hours tearing my home office apart. I emptied filing cabinets. I crawled into the attic, choking on fiberglass insulation, dragging down heavy cardboard boxes filled with decades-old tax returns and utility bills. Finally, at the bottom of a plastic tote smelling faintly of mothballs, I found it. The original deed and the property survey from 1971, when my grandfather first bought the parcel. I unfolded the large yellowing sheet of drafting paper on the dining room table. I weighed the corners down with coffee mugs. I studied the crisp, hand-drawn lines of the surveyor's ink. My grandfather's parcel wasn't a perfect square. It was shaped like a keyhole. I knew about the main acre where the house sat. But there was a detail on this 1971 map that didn't make sense. At the very front of the property, near the county road, there was a long, narrow strip, 20 feet wide and 300 feet long, extending outward like a tail. The map labeled it private access right-of-way, ingress egress granted to adjacent agricultural parcels. Reverts to primary title holder upon cessation of agricultural use. I stared at it. I traced the line with my finger. I needed to see the modern overlay. I called my boss, told him I had a family emergency, and drove 40 minutes to the county records building. It was a bleak, concrete municipal building that smelled of floor wax and stale air. I found a clerk at a desk behind a thick pane of plexiglass. Her name tag read Helen. She looked like she'd worked there since the Ford administration. I need to pull the current plat maps and zoning overlays for Oak Ridge Estates, I said, sliding my driver's license under the glass. And I need to cross-reference them with parcel 402, my property. Helen adjusted her glasses, typed agonizingly slowly into a terminal that looked older than I was, and pointed to a corner of the room. Microfiche machine is over there, honey. Drawer 4B for the new developments. I'll print the master overlay. 50 cents a page. I sat at the machine for 2 hours. The glowing green screen burned my eyes. I pulled up the developer's master plan for Oak Ridge Estates, filed 3 years ago. I printed it. I took the new map and laid it over my grandfather's 1971 survey. I held them both up against the harsh, fluorescent light of the records room to see through the paper. My heart stopped. Then it started beating so fast I felt dizzy. Oak Ridge Estates used to be agricultural land. The developer had bought it all up, changed the zoning, and built their luxury subdivision. But they had rushed the surveying. They had assumed that the 20-foot access road at the front of the property was public county land, or a dead easement that transferred to them. It wasn't. When the agricultural use ceased, the exact moment the developer broke ground, that 20-foot strip of land legally reverted to the primary title holder, me. I looked closely at the modern Oak Ridge map. I looked at where they had built their infrastructure over that specific 20-foot strip. Oak Ridge had a grand entrance, massive brick pillars, a wrought iron mechanical gate, a beautifully paved median with a fountain. That entire entrance was built exactly across the middle of my 20-foot strip. But it got better. The strip extended down the side of the road. It didn't just cover the entrance, it covered the first 10 feet of the front yards of the first 4 houses on the left side of the street. It covered the utility boxes, and most importantly, it covered the bottom half of their driveways. The concrete aprons connecting those 4 houses to the street sat squarely on my property. One of those houses belonged to Richard. I didn't just own their grand entrance. I owned the only way Richard could get his pristine white Audi out of his garage. I slowly lowered the papers. I didn't smile. It wasn't a happy feeling. It was a dark, heavy, industrial sense of purpose. Richard wanted to play games with property lines. He wanted to claim that boundary disputes were civil matters that the police couldn't touch. He wanted to build walls on land he didn't own. I walked back to Helen's desk. I paid her for the prints. "Find what you were looking for, honey?" she asked, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Yes, ma'am," I said, carefully folding the documents and sliding them into my jacket. I just found out I have a lot more landscaping to do. I drove home in silence. I didn't listen to the radio. I was building a timeline in my head. I needed permits. I needed concrete. I needed rebar. And most of all, I needed to wait for Monday morning when Richard and all his wealthy, complaining neighbors drove off to their executive jobs, leaving their neighborhood totally empty. They built a wall on my land to keep me out. I was going to build a wall on my land to lock them in. When I walked back into the house, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table. Her eyes were red. She had a cup of tea in front of her that had long gone cold. She looked up at me, searching my face. Oyeeki, she knew me well enough to know when the gears in my head had shifted from grief to something else. I laid the 2 pieces of paper flat on the table, side by side. I explained the zoning. I explained the agricultural reversion clause. I traced the 20-foot strip with my index finger, showing her exactly how it sliced through the pristine, expensive heart of Oak Ridge Estates. Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at the lines. She was an elementary school teacher. She spent her days managing chaos with deep wells of patience. But beneath that cardigan-wearing exterior was a woman who had grown up with 3 older brothers. She understood the currency of a well-earned retaliation. "How much?" she asked quietly. How much what? How much is it going to cost to build a wall?" she clarified, her voice dropping into a register I rarely heard. It was cold. It was deliberate. "Whatever is left in the savings account," I said. "The wedding drained most of it. We have about $12,000 left. That was supposed to be for the new roof." Sarah looked out the kitchen window. From where she sat, she could see the top of the ugly, beige stucco wall the HOA had built over our grandfather's maples. She stared at it for a solid minute. "The roof only leaks in heavy rain," she said, turning back to me. Her eyes were hard now. "Buy the concrete." The next 3 days were a masterclass in bureaucratic navigation. If you want to do something out of spite, you have to do it by the book. Emotion makes you sloppy. I couldn't just throw up some plywood and chicken wire. Richard would have the county out there, tearing it down by noon, citing a dozen code violations. No, my wall had to be an immaculate, permitted, legally bulletproof fortress. Thursday morning, I hired an independent surveyor. I paid a premium for a rush job. A guy named Tom showed up with his tripod and laser levels. I handed him the 1971 deed and the modern overlays. Tom spent 4 hours walking the property line, shooting measurements and consulting a GPS unit the size of a brick. When he finished, he pounded thick wooden stakes into the ground, tying them off with bright, neon pink surveyor's tape. The tape cut a savage line across the neighborhood. It started at the county road, ran directly through the center of the brick and wrought iron Oak Ridge Estates entrance gate, and continued down the grass shoulder. It sliced neatly across the bottom third of 4 concrete driveways. Tom packed up his gear, shaking his head. "Buddy, I don't know who dropped the ball at the title company when they built this subdivision, but they screwed up royal. This 20-foot strip is clear as day on the master registry. It's yours." Agricultural reversion. You own the asphalt, the concrete, and the dirt underneath it. I took the certified survey straight to the county permit office. I applied for an agricultural boundary enclosure. Under county law, a property owner has the fundamental right to enclose their land to prevent trespassing, provided the structure doesn't exceed certain height restrictions without engineering plans. I wasn't building an 8-foot monolith like Richard. I didn't need to. I submitted plans for a 4-foot-high reinforced cinder block barrier, solid core, rebar driven deep into the earth. It was perfectly legal. The clerk rubber-stamped it. Friday was for logistics. I found a masonry contractor named Greg who operated out of a metal pole barn 2 towns over. He was a guy who communicated mostly in grunts and took his coffee black. I laid the approved permits and the survey on the hood of his truck. "I need 300 feet of block wall," I told him. 4 feet high, core filled with high PSI concrete, heavy rebar, and I need it built in a single day. Greg looked at the paperwork, then at me. 300 feet in a day? You're talking a massive crew. 2 pump trucks. You're paying triple labor for a rush job like that. "I have $10,000 cash," I said, "and I need it done this coming Monday, starting at exactly 8:30 in the morning." Greg squinted. He looked at the address on the permit. He recognized the street. Everyone knew Oak Ridge Estates. "You're building a block wall across a subdivision entrance and 4 driveways?" "I'm building an agricultural boundary enclosure on my legally surveyed property," I corrected him. Greg slowly grinned. It was a terrifying missing tooth smile. "Monday at 8:30. Have the cash in an envelope." Over the weekend I didn't mow my lawn. I didn't weed the flower beds. I just sat on my back porch, drinking cheap beer, staring at the beige stucco wall Richard had built over my grandfather's garden. Every time I felt a twinge of guilt, every time the rational part of my brain told me this was an insane escalation, I just looked at the crushed maple branch sticking out from the bottom of their masonry. They took my sanctuary. They thought the rules didn't apply to them because their bank accounts were bigger. Sunday night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Sarah was asleep beside me, her breathing steady. She had trusted me with our savings. She had trusted me to fix this. At 6 a.m. on Monday, I was standing in my driveway with a thermos of coffee. I watched the morning routine of Oak Ridge Estates unfold. At 7:15, a parade of luxury SUVs and German sedans began to filter out of the neighborhood, turning onto the county road. I saw Richard's pristine white Audi back out of his driveway, cross the property line, and glide through the grand brick entrance, heading toward the city. By 8:15, the neighborhood was a ghost town. The executives, the regional managers, the HOA board members, they were all gone. At 8:28 a.m., a low, heavy rumble vibrated through the soles of my boots. A convoy turned off the county road. 2 massive concrete mixer trucks, 3 flatbed trailers loaded with pallets of gray cinder blocks, and 4 pickup trucks carrying 12 men in high-visibility vests. Greg stepped out of the lead truck. He looked at the neon pink surveyor's tape fluttering in the morning breeze. He looked at the brick entrance gate. He looked at the manicured lawns. "Boys!" Greg yelled, clapping his thick hands together. The sound echoed off the expensive houses. "We've got a lot of block to lay and a lot of mud to pour. Let's get to work." A construction site is a chaotic symphony. It looks like madness to an outsider, but it's a tightly choreographed sequence of events. Greg's crew was a machine. They started with the asphalt. You can't lay a foundation on top of a paved road. You have to cut it. Two men fired up heavy-duty masonry saws. The screaming whine of the diamond-tipped blades tearing into the asphalt shattered the suburban quiet. Plumes of white dust and gray slurry kicked up into the air. They cut a 2-foot-wide trench perfectly straight across the entrance of Oak Ridge Estates, right along my pink surveyor's line. Then they moved to the 4 driveways, cutting deep trenches through the thick, stamped concrete of Richard and his neighbors' properties. By 10 a.m., a backhoe had ripped the cut asphalt and concrete out of the ground, exposing the raw earth beneath. They didn't bother pulling permits to demolish the HOA's mechanical entrance gate. They didn't have to. The heavy wrought iron gate was anchored to brick pillars that sat on the developer's side of the line, but the gate itself swung outward over my property. "Hey, buddy," Greg called out over the noise of a diesel engine. He pointed at the massive iron gate. "When we build this wall, that gate ain't gonna be able to close. It's gonna hit the block." "That sounds like an HOA maintenance issue," I yelled back. Greg laughed and waved a pump truck forward. They drilled deep into the dirt, pounding thick steel rebar stakes into the ground every 16 inches. Then the block laying began. 12 men working in tandem, slathering thick gray mortar, stacking the heavy blocks with mechanical precision. 4 feet high. It wasn't tall enough to block the view. You could easily see over it. You could even climb over it if you wanted to, but you absolutely could not drive a 2-ton vehicle through it. It was a solid, reinforced vehicle barricade. The wall started at the far edge of the county road, ran directly across the Oak Ridge entrance, blocking both the in and out lanes. It continued down the grass shoulder and then meticulously cut across the bottom of the first 4 driveways, leaving the homeowners with a useless square of concrete trapped between their garages and a 4-foot wall. By 2 p.m., the forms were stacked. The pump trucks extended their long hydraulic booms over the street. Thick, wet, gray concrete began flowing into the hollow cores of the cinder blocks, entombing the rebar. This wasn't a decorative fence. This was a dam. Once that concrete cured, you would need heavy explosives or a wrecking ball to move it. I stood on my front porch, watching the spectacle. The smell of wet dust and diesel exhaust filled the air. Sarah came out and stood next to me. She handed me a sandwich. We ate in silence, watching our savings account harden into a permanent monument to spite. By 4:30 p.m., Greg's crew was packing up. The wall was finished. The wet mortar was already turning a lighter shade of gray as it baked in the late afternoon sun. I handed Greg a thick manila envelope. He counted it, nodded, and tipped his hard hat to Sarah. "Pleasure doing business with you folks," Greg grunted. He climbed into his truck and the convoy rumbled away, leaving behind an eerie, heavy silence. I pulled up a lawn chair, placed it right at the edge of my property near the county road, and opened a beer. At 5:15 p.m., the first resident returned. It was a silver Lexus SUV. It turned off the main road, heading for the grand entrance of Oak Ridge Estates. The driver hit the brakes so hard, the tires chirped. The SUV stopped 3 feet from the solid block wall, now spanning the entrance. The driver, a woman in her 40s wearing oversized sunglasses, laid on the horn. She leaned out the window. "Excuse me, what is this? Move this immediately." I took a sip of my beer. I didn't move. Within 10 minutes, a line of 6 cars had formed behind her, spilling out onto the shoulder of the county road. Horns were blaring. People were getting out of their vehicles, pointing, yelling, waving their arms in the air. Then, the white Audi arrived. Richard pulled up to the growing traffic jam. He got out of his car, his pastel polo shirt looking a little wrinkled after a long day at the office. He pushed his way through the crowd of confused, angry neighbors. When he saw the wall, he stopped dead in his tracks. The clipboard he was holding slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the asphalt. He looked at the wall blocking the entrance. He looked down the street. He saw the wall continuing perfectly across the bottom of his own driveway, locking his wife's car inside the garage and completely preventing him from ever parking his Audi there again. He finally looked at me. He was standing on the county road. I was sitting on my lawn chair on my property. Between us was 4 feet of freshly poured, heavily reinforced concrete. His face went from pale to a deep, mottled red. The veins in his neck popped. "David!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking. He stormed up to the wall. "What the hell is this? Have you lost your mind? I will sue you into oblivion. I will have you arrested." "For what, Richard?" I asked calmly, not getting out of my chair. "Building an agricultural enclosure on my land." "This is an entrance. This is a public road." "No," I corrected, pulling a folded copy of the 1971 survey from my back pocket and tossing it over the wall. It landed at his feet. "It was an agricultural access easement. It reverted to the title holder when you broke ground. Check the county records. You built your fancy gate and your driveways on my dirt, and honestly, it was a severe blight on my aesthetic." Richard stared at the paper. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just dealing with an angry neighbor anymore. He was dealing with a massive, multi-million-dollar title defect. He pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking worse than mine had been on Tuesday night. He dialed 911. 20 minutes later, a patrol car arrived with its lights flashing. The crowd parted to let the officer through. I smiled. It was Officer Miller. He looked even more tired than he had last week. Miller stepped out of his cruiser, took off his hat, and wiped sweat from his forehead. He looked at the angry mob of wealthy homeowners. He looked at the massive concrete barricade. He looked at me, sitting in my lawn chair with a half-empty beer. "Mr. Hayes," Miller sighed heavily, walking up to the wall. "Officer Miller." I nodded politely. "Arrest him," Richard shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He blocked a public roadway. He vandalized our driveways. He's holding us hostage." Miller held up a hand to silence Richard. He looked down at the freshly cut asphalt. He looked at the neon pink surveyor's tape still clinging to the stakes on my side of the wall. "Mr. Hayes," Miller said slowly, "do you have permits for this structure?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out the county-stamped approval forms, and handed them over the wall. Miller unfolded them. He read the permit. He read the attached survey overlay. He was quiet for a long time. The crowd of neighbors held their breath, waiting for the handcuffs to come out. Finally, Miller folded the papers and handed them back to me. He hooked his thumbs into his duty belt and turned to face Richard. "Well, sir," Miller said, adopting that exact same practiced, de-escalating flatness he had used on me a week ago. "It appears Mr. Hayes has built a legally permitted boundary wall entirely on his own surveyed property." "It's blocking my driveway," Richard screamed. "I get that you're upset," Miller said, shrugging. "But I don't see anyone actively trespassing. If you claim this is your land and he has county documents claiming it's his." Miller paused, looking Richard dead in the eye, delivering the line I had been waiting 6 days to hear. "That's a property dispute. I can't arrest a wall. It's a civil matter. Have a good night." Miller's cruiser pulled away, the tail lights bleeding red into the gathering dusk. The silence he left behind lasted exactly 3 seconds before the chaos broke loose. It was a beautiful, ugly thing to watch. 60 wealthy homeowners realized all at once that they were locked out of their own neighborhood. The main entrance was sealed. The 4 driveways closest to the road were amputated. There was a secondary dirt access road for construction vehicles on the far east side of the development, but it was heavily rutted, unpaved, and currently chained shut. For the residents of Oak Ridge Estates, the only way home was on foot. They parked their Lexuses, their BMWs, and their oversized SUVs on the soft, grassy shoulder of the 2-lane county highway. It hadn't rained in a week, but the evening dew was already settling. Men in Italian leather loafers and women in expensive heels had to abandon their vehicles, step into the damp ditch, and hike around my 4-foot concrete barricade. I sat in my lawn chair and watched them. Some glared at me, a few yelled obscenities. Most just looked exhausted, dragging briefcases and gym bags over the uneven ground. Richard didn't walk home. He stood by his white Audi, dialed his phone, and paced. He yelled into the receiver, waving his free hand wildly at my wall. He looked small. The clipboard was still lying on the asphalt. Sarah came out an hour later. She brought 2 heavy wool blankets. She draped one over my shoulders and wrapped the other around herself. pulling up a second lawn chair next to mine. The floodlights from the subdivision entrance illuminated the concrete. It was stark, gray, and aggressively permanent. "It's really ugly, David," she said quietly. "I know." "Are we the bad guys now?" she asked, her voice tight. I looked at the jagged edge of the stucco wall they had built over my grandfather's trees. I looked at the crushed maple branch, still trapped under their masonry. "No," I said. "We're just the people who stopped playing nice." The siege of Oak Ridge Estates lasted 12 days, and the logistical nightmare compounded with every sunrise. Tuesday morning, the garbage trucks arrived. The drivers took one look at the concrete wall blocking the gate, backed up, and drove away. By Thursday, the green plastic bins lining the pristine streets were overflowing. The stench of rotting food and diapers drifted over the manicured lawns. Amazon and FedEx drivers refused to carry boxes a quarter-mile down the street. They simply stacked them on top of my concrete wall. The grand entrance to Oak Ridge Estates became a makeshift loading dock. Piles of cardboard boxes, grocery deliveries, and dry cleaning bags teetered on the gray cinder blocks. The aesthetic standard of excellence in living had devolved into a refugee camp for prime delivery. Richard tried to fight back. On day 3, a process server trudged up my driveway and handed me a thick manila envelope. It was a cease and desist order drafted by the HOA's law firm. It was full of threatening legal jargon, injunctions, tortious interference, public nuisance claims. It demanded the immediate removal of the wall, or I would face lawsuits exceeding $1 million. I used the paperwork to start the charcoal grill that evening. I cooked hot dogs and watched the smoke drift toward Richard's trapped house. I knew the lawyers were bluffing. They had pulled the title records the second Richard called them. They knew what the developer had done. You cannot file an injunction against a man for building a fence on his own legally deeded property. The only way they could force the wall down was through eminent domain, which an HOA cannot exercise, or by taking me to court for a prescriptive easement, a process that takes years and tens of thousands of dollars. They didn't have years. They barely had days. By the second weekend, the neighborhood had turned on Richard. I saw it happen on a Saturday afternoon. I was pulling weeds in the front yard when a group of 10 residents cornered Richard near the wall. They were furious. They were tired of parking on the highway. They were tired of the garbage. One of the men, a guy whose driveway I had sealed off, was jabbing a finger into Richard's chest. "You built that wall on his trees," the man yelled, his voice carrying over the property line. "You told the board the survey was clear. You lied to us, Richard. Now my wife has to walk half a mile in the dark to get to her own house." Richard stammered, his face flushed. "We are handling it. Legal is handling it. This is extortion." "I don't care what it is," the neighbor roared. "Fix it, or we are recalling the entire board by Tuesday." The facade had cracked. The beige utopia was eating itself alive. On day 12, the heavy hitters arrived. It wasn't Richard. It wasn't the HOA board. It was a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepping out of a Blacktown car that had parked on the shoulder. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely devoid of emotion. He walked past the wall, up my gravel driveway, and knocked on my front door. I opened it, holding my coffee mug. Sarah stood just behind me. "Mr. Hayes," the man said. He didn't offer to shake my hand. "My name is Thomas Vance. I am senior counsel for the Vanguard Development Corporation." Vanguard, the company that built Oak Ridge Estates, the people who actually had money. "Come in, Thomas," I said, stepping aside. We sat at the kitchen table. I didn't offer him coffee. He placed a leather briefcase on the table, clicked the brass latches open, and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Let's bypass the posturing, Mr. Hayes," Thomas said, his voice smooth and transactional. "The HOA board is incompetent. Richard made a colossal error in judgment by building that stucco wall over your property line. But Vanguard Development is now facing a massive liability issue. We sold 60 homes with guaranteed clean titles. Your agricultural reversion claim creates a defect on 4 of those titles, plus the main entrance." "Your surveyor rushed the job," I said. "He did," Thomas admitted without blinking. "And our title insurance company is currently having a localized panic attack. If those homeowners sue us for selling them land we didn't own, it will cost us millions. So we are stepping in to clean up Richard's mess. I am authorized to purchase the 20-foot strip from you." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a purchase agreement. The number on the bottom line was 50 Thor. I looked at it. I looked at Sarah. She kept her face completely blank. I slid the paper back across the table. No. Thomas sighed, a tight, controlled exhalation. Mr. Hayes, $50,000 for a 300-foot strip of dirt is incredibly generous. You can buy a lot of new trees. You don't understand the math, Thomas, I said, leaning forward. I don't just own dirt. I own the only paved entrance to your multi-million-dollar development. I own the concrete under Richard's cars. Every day my wall stands there. Vanguard bleeds reputation. Every day the threat of a class action lawsuit from your own buyers grows. I don't want $50,000. What do you want? I pulled a sheet of notebook paper from my pocket. I had written it out 3 nights ago. I unfolded it and read it aloud. 1. The stucco wall your HOA built on my land comes down. Today, your crews, your dime, all the debris removed. Thomas nodded slowly. Done on 2. You replace what was destroyed. I want 2 mature, 30-year-old Japanese maples and 30 feet of mature lilac bushes transported and planted on my property by a certified arborist. Not saplings, mature trees. That is logistically difficult and extremely expensive, Thomas noted. Find a nursery, pay the freight. I didn't blunk. Fine, what else? 3. The HOA drops all aesthetic code requirements regarding my property, permanently, deed restricted. You never speak to me about my grass, my fence, or my leaves ever again. Agreed. Thomas tapped his pen against the legal pad. And the price for the 20-foot strip? I looked at Sarah. She nodded once. $250,000, I said. Cash out refinance, wired directly to my account by Friday. Once the money clears and the trees are in the ground, I will sign the deed over, and you can tear down my concrete wall. Thomas stopped tapping his pen. He stared at me. The silence in the kitchen stretched so long I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. He was doing the math. He was weighing $250,000 against a multi-million-dollar title fraud lawsuit and the total collapse of the Oak Ridge project. He didn't argue. He didn't counteroffer. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a different contract, crossed out a number with his pen, and wrote in $250,000. He initialed it, spun it around, and handed me the pen. Sign it, Thomas said. I took the pen. I felt the cold plastic against my fingers. I signed my name. Sarah signed beneath mine. The demolition of the HOA's stucco wall began the next morning. I sat on the porch with Sarah drinking coffee, watching the same bobcat skid steer that had destroyed my grandfather's garden systematically smash Richard's beige fortress into rubble. The loud, rhythmic pounding of the hydraulic hammer cracking the cinder blocks felt like a heartbeat. It took them 2 days to clear the debris. On the 3rd day, a massive flatbed truck arrived from a specialized nursery 3 states away. It carried 2 massive, sprawling Japanese maples, their root balls wrapped in burlap, hoisted into the air by a heavy crane. They lowered the trees into the soil. They planted the lilacs. They smoothed the dirt. On Friday morning, I checked my bank account. The wire transfer had cleared. We had enough to buy a new roof, fix the drafty windows, and pay off the mortgage entirely. I called Greg the mason. Bring the backhoe, I said. Demolishing my own wall was harder than building it. High PSI concrete core filled with rebar doesn't give up easily. It took Greg's crew 12 hours of deafening, bone-rattling labor to break the barricade apart. They ripped the jagged chunks of concrete out of the ground, exposing the torn asphalt and the severed driveways beneath. When the dust finally settled, the entrance to Oak Ridge Estates was open again. It looked like a war zone. The pavement was scarred, uneven, and covered in gray dust, but the cars could pass. Richard didn't come outside to watch the demolition. In fact, Richard didn't come outside much at all anymore. A week later, a moving truck backed into his driveway. The neighborhood had held their emergency meeting. Richard was stripped of his HOA presidency. The shame of being the man who locked his entire community out of their own homes was too much. He put his pristine corner lot on the market and sold it at a loss just to get out. I watched him load the last of his boxes into his white Audi. He never looked over the property line. He got in, put the car in drive, and rolled slowly over the patched asphalt where my wall used to be. He turned onto the county highway and disappeared. I walked to the western edge of my property. The earth was still soft and dark where the heavy machinery had churned it up, The new Japanese maples stood tall, their red leaves rustling quietly in the evening breeze. They weren't my grandfather's trees. The history in those roots was gone, buried under the arrogance of people who thought money gave them the right to take what wasn't theirs. But these trees would grow. Their roots would dig deep into the soil, and they would outlast the stucco, the concrete, and the perfectly manicured lawns next door. Sarah walked up behind me. She slipped her hand into mine. We stood together, listening to the wind move through the branches, looking out at the island we had defended. It was quiet, and it was ours. If you've ever had to deal with an HOA overstepping their bounds, you know exactly how exhausting it can be to protect what is rightfully yours. David's story proves that sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with expensive lawyers, but with the very rules they try to use against you. Sometimes you just have to draw a hard line in the concrete. If you love this story of ultimate revenge, hit that like button, share this video with someone who hates their HOA, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of neighbors fighting back.